For years, Americans were told Antifa wasn't really an organization. No leadership, no structure, no network. Apparently, we were supposed to believe that people dressed exactly alike, using the same tactics, appearing at the same demonstrations, sharing intelligence on police movements, raising money, providing legal support, identifying targets, and sometimes engaging in coordinated violence were all just independently having the exact same idea at the exact same time. Well, the federal government isn't buying it anymore. The question now isn't simply who threw the bottle, who started the fire, who attacked the officer. The questions are getting bigger. Who organized it? Who coordinated it? Who financed it? Who provided logistical support? And what networks exist behind the people committing politically motivated violence? If the federal government is serious about answering those questions, they might want to take a very close look at the Pacific Northwest. Because those of us who monitor radical activity here every single week already know something much of the country is only beginning to understand. The infrastructure is already here.
From Seattle to Los Angeles, this is Left Coast News. No apologies, just the truth.
Every week we go through protest activity, political organizing, activist networks, and potential public safety concerns throughout Washington and the Pacific Northwest. We watch the calendars, we watch the organizations, we watch the coalitions. We watch who promotes those events, and week after week, many of the same ideological movements keep appearing. Different organization names, different causes, different posters, but often the same locations, overlapping movements, shared demonstrations, similar rhetoric, and sometimes the same activists moving from one cause to another. Now the federal government appears increasingly interested in something that should have been seriously examined years ago: the networks behind organized political violence. And that could have enormous implications for the radical political ecosystem operating right here in the Pacific Northwest. The federal government is changing the way it looks at Antifa. The Trump administration has moved to formally treat Antifa as a domestic terrorist threat and has directed federal agencies to focus more aggressively on organized political violence and the networks surrounding it. That matters, because for years the entire public discussion surrounding Antifa was deliberately trapped inside one ridiculous argument. Antifa isn't an organization. Fine. Then stop looking for a national headquarters with an Antifa receptionist answering the telephone. Stop expecting membership cards. Start looking at networks. Look at individual cells. Look at communications. Look at financial relationships. Look at organizations providing logistical assistance. Look at who purchases equipment, who arranges transportation, who conducts surveillance, who identifies targets, who coordinates demonstrations, who tracks police movements, who provides support when people are arrested, and most importantly, when violence occurs, who knew what was going to happen before it happened. Because serious investigations follow conduct, they follow communications and relationships, and they follow the money. That could become extremely significant here in the Pacific Northwest. We have been watching this ecosystem for years. Anyone who follows our weekly watch reports knows exactly what I'm talking about. The Pacific Northwest has one of the most developed radical activist environments anywhere in America. Seattle, Olympia, Tacoma, Portland. These cities have repeatedly served as organizing centers for anarchist, revolutionary socialist, communist, militant anti-capitalist, anti-police, and Antifa-aligned activism. And I want to make something extremely clear. Being a communist is not a crime. Being an anarchist is not a crime. Being a socialist is not a crime. Hating Donald Trump is not a crime. Hating the United States is not a crime. Even burning an American flag, as disgusting as many Americans find it, including myself, is generally constitutionally protected expression. The First Amendment protects political speech precisely because government cannot be trusted with the authority to decide which political opinions Americans are allowed to hold. But the Constitution does not protect political violence. It does not protect arson. It doesn't protect assault. It doesn't protect criminal threats. It does not protect vandalism. It doesn't protect criminal conspiracies, and it does not give anyone the right to use violence or intimidation to force their political ideology onto somebody else. Putting on black clothing and calling yourself an activist doesn't magically transform criminal behavior into protected political expression. That is the line. And that is where federal investigators should be concentrating their attention. Look at the Pacific Northwest. Every week we track organizations and movements operating throughout this region. Revolutionary socialists, communist organizations, anarchist networks, anti-capitalist movements, militant anti-ICE activists, organizations openly hostile to traditional American institutions, and coalitions capable of mobilizing significant numbers of people around major political events. Now, does that mean every organization attending a radical demonstration is engaged in terrorism? It doesn't mean everyone standing next to Antifa activist is Antifa. And it certainly doesn't mean everyone holding a socialist sign should be investigated by the federal government. Guilt by association has no place in legitimate American law enforcement, but neither does deliberate blindness. When individuals move beyond political advocacy and become knowingly involved in coordinated criminal violence, that is an entirely different matter. And this is where a serious federal investigation could completely change the game. For years, local governments in places like Portland and Seattle have treated recurring political violence primarily as a public order problem. A riot happens, police make a few arrests, someone gets charged with assault or property destruction. Charges sometimes disappear. The crowd goes home. Then everyone comes back 3 weeks later under another banner. Wash, rinse, repeat. But a conspiracy investigation asks completely different questions. Was the violence coordinated? Was specialized equipment acquired beforehand? Were targets selected? Were communications used to coordinate illegal activity? Were people assigned specific roles? Did individuals travel across state lines to participate? Was somebody financing criminal conduct? Were federal officers or facilities deliberately targeted? Suddenly, you're no longer investigating one person who threw one object. You're investigating the network surrounding the incident. Portland should be ground zero. If federal investigators want a case study, Portland practically comes with its own archive. The city has experienced years of recurring confrontations involving black bloc tactics, attacks against law enforcement, destruction of property, and repeated confrontations surrounding federal facilities. Portland illustrates the central problem perfectly. The public is repeatedly told these demonstrations are spontaneous, but when similar tactics repeatedly appear, when specialized equipment appears, when activists communicate about law enforcement movements, when people repeatedly return to the same targets, when logistical support exists, at some point, investigators are going to ask whether they're actually looking at a spontaneous unrest or organized criminal activity. That doesn't automatically prove a conspiracy. But when violence repeatedly follows recognizable patterns, law enforcement has every legitimate reason to investigate whether coordination exists. And Washington State should be watching very closely. The I-5 Radical Corridor. Washington is not isolated from what happens in Portland. Our weekly monitoring repeatedly shows ideological and organizational overlap throughout the Interstate 5 corridor. Portland, Olympia, Tacoma, Seattle. Activists share information. Organizations amplify each other's events. National movements feed local demonstrations. Coalitions form around specific causes. And major political flashpoints can mobilize activists across multiple cities. We've watched organizing surrounding ICE, Gaza, anti-capitalism, anti-police movements, socialist and communist organizations, anarchist movements, and confrontations involving federal immigration enforcement. Again, protesting any of these issues is constitutionally protected. But if people within those movements use legitimate demonstrations as cover to plan violence, attack officers, destroy property, intimidate political opponents, or violently interfere with lawful government operations, law enforcement should investigate them. I don't care whether the ideology comes from the radical left or the radical right. The standard should be conduct. The law should be applied equally. That is what constitutional government requires. And then there's the DSA. But Antifa isn't the only movement Americans should be paying attention to, because while Antifa-associated activists often operate through decentralized networks, another organization is laying out a radical political transformation right in the open, the Democratic Socialists of America. And understand something about the DSA. This isn't an obscure internet group with 12 people sitting in somebody's basement arguing about Marx. This is a national political organization with chapters across the United States. Its members and endorsed candidates have held elected office. Its activists participate in major political coalitions. Its chapters organize demonstrations throughout the country. And we regularly see DSA organizations operating right here in the Pacific Northwest. But their national political program has moved far beyond arguing about minimum wage increases or government health care. The DSA is openly calling for what it describes as a new political system. Their program calls for abolishing the United States Senate, not reforming it, not changing Senate rules, abolishing it. They oppose replacing the independent presidency with an executive selected by and subordinate to the national legislature. And they propose replacing the independent Supreme Court with a judicial body selected by and subordinate to that same legislature. Think about what that actually means. No United States Senate, no independently elected president, no independent Supreme Court, and an entirely different constitutional structure centered around a dominant national legislature. I'm sorry, but what exactly are we supposed to call that? If a conservative organization released a national platform declaring that America needed a new political system and proposed eliminating the Senate, replacing the independent presidency, and eliminating the Supreme Court as an independent branch of government, the national media would call it an existential threat to democracy before breakfast. There would be congressional hearings, there would be documentaries, there would be breathless television specials about the collapse of American institutions. But when the largest socialist organization in America proposes fundamentally replacing major components of our constitutional structure, suddenly everybody becomes remarkably uninterested. Why the founders created checks and balances? Our constitutional system was deliberately designed around separated powers: legislative, executive, judicial. Those branches were intentionally made independent because the founders understood something that apparently requires regular rediscovery. Human beings cannot be trusted with unlimited political power. That includes Republicans, that includes Democrats, that includes socialists, and that includes whoever happens to promise you everything you want during the next election. The entire constitutional structure exists because power needs competition. The president checks Congress. Congress checks the president. The judiciary checks both. At least that's how it's supposed to work. The Senate provides equal representation to the states as sovereign members of the federal union. The House represents population. Federalism divides power, again, between Washington and the states. It is intentionally inefficient. That's a feature, not a bug. Because a government powerful enough to completely transform your life overnight is also powerful enough to completely destroy it overnight. And what the DSA is proposing would fundamentally restructure those safeguards. They have every constitutional right to advocate for that, but Americans also have every right to understand exactly what they're advocating. This is bigger than Antifa. The broader radical left has also spent years promoting ideas involving prison abolition, police abolition, dismantling immigration enforcement, eliminating traditional property relationships, and fundamentally transforming America's economic system. Again, advocating those ideas is protected speech. But Americans should pay attention when political movements tell us what they want, because there is a major difference between saying we want to reform America and saying we need an entirely new political system. And this is where the broader ecosystem becomes important. You have socialist organizations seeking to dismantle existing constitutional institutions. You have revolutionary communist organizations advocating the replacement of capitalism. You have anarchist networks rejecting the authority of the state itself. You have militant organizations demanding the abolition of police and prisons. You have activists describing America itself as an illegitimate colonial or imperialist project. And then, operating at the extreme edges of the broader political environment, you have individuals willing to engage in violence. Those are not automatically the same people. That distinction matters. But pretending there is never any overlap between these political ecosystems is equally ridiculous. They attend some of the same demonstrations. They form coalitions. They promote each other's events. They share political narratives. They sometimes share organizing infrastructure. And many identify the same institutions as enemies or obstacles: police, ICE, the courts, capitalism, the federal government, and increasingly America's existing constitutional order. The line between radicalism and terrorism. This is where we need to be extremely precise. A DSA member advocating the abolition of the Senate is not a terrorist. An anarchist calling for the elimination of government is not automatically a terrorist. A communist demanding the end of capitalism is not automatically a terrorist. The First Amendment protects radical political advocacy. It should. Because the moment government can declare political beliefs themselves to be terrorism, every American becomes vulnerable whenever political power changes hands. But when someone moves from advocating revolution to planning violence, the situation changes. When people organize attacks, when they identify targets, when they coordinate criminal activity, when they stockpile equipment specifically for violence, when they conduct surveillance for criminal purposes, when they finance violent operations, when they attack law enforcement officers, when they attempt to intimidate political opponents through violence, that is no longer simply political speech. That is where legitimate criminal and terrorism investigations begin. The government must prove its case. It must establish probable cause, and it must obtain warrants where constitutionally required. Defendants receive due process. The government presents evidence, and a jury decides guilt. That's the American system. We should never abandon that system while claiming to defend it. Follow the money. The most consequential part of this federal shift may ultimately have nothing to do with street arrests. It may be financial, because organized political activity requires resources. Transportation costs money. Equipment costs money. Communication infrastructure also costs money. Legal assistance costs money. Media operations cost money. Organizing costs money. Most advocacy organizations and nonprofits operate completely legally. But if investigators establish that an individual or organization knowingly provided resources specifically to facilitate criminal violence, that creates an entirely different legal question. And that is why following financial relationships could potentially be far more consequential than arresting another masked rioter. You can arrest the guy who throws the brick. Someone else can pick up another brick tomorrow. But if criminal violence is actually being organized, financed, or coordinated through larger networks, identifying that infrastructure is how you dismantle the operation. If such infrastructure exists, expose it, prove it, and prosecute the crimes. Do it in open court. Do it with evidence. Do it with due process. That is how a constitutional republic responds to political violence. Conservatives should also be careful. And there is a warning here for conservatives. Do not cheer for unlimited government power simply because today's target is Antifa. We've already watched federal agencies abuse surveillance authorities. We've watched government institutions investigate political movements. We've watched politicians attempt to label their political opponents extremists. The First Amendment does not disappear because someone in Washington uses the word terrorism. If we build a government machine capable of targeting people solely because of their political beliefs, eventually someone else will control that machine. And maybe they'll decide you're the extremist. Maybe they'll decide your gun club is a militia. Maybe they'll decide your church is radical. Maybe they'll decide your opposition to government policy is dangerous. We've seen through history to know exactly how this works. This is why the constitutional line matters. Investigate violence. Investigate credible threats. Investigate criminal conspiracies. Investigate deliberate attacks against police and federal officers. Investigate financing knowingly connected to criminal violence. But protect political speech, even ugly political speech, even socialist political speech, even anti-American political speech. Because we don't defeat authoritarianism by giving the government authoritarian powers. The era of looking the other way may be ending. For years, Americans watched political violence erupt while politicians argued over vocabulary. Was it Antifa? Was it anarchists? Was it autonomous activists? Was it just spontaneous collection of people who coincidentally arrived wearing identical clothing and carrying similar equipment? At some point, the semantics stopped mattering. If people organize political violence, investigate the violence. If networks coordinate criminal activity, investigate the networks. If people knowingly finance criminal operations, follow the money. And if the evidence proves a criminal conspiracy, prosecute everyone responsible. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we're going to continue doing exactly what we've been doing every week: watching, documenting, connecting publicly available information, separating peaceful political activism from genuine public safety threats, and paying attention to the organizations and movements operating in our communities. Because we've been watching this develop for years. We've watched radical organizations become increasingly interconnected. We've watched revolutionary rhetoric become increasingly mainstream. And now the largest socialist organization in America is openly proposing a new political system that would eliminate the Senate and replace the independent presidency and Supreme Court. At the same time, the federal government is beginning to take a much harder look at the networks surrounding politically motivated violence. Those two developments are not the same thing, but together they tell us something important about where America is right now. The political divide is no longer simply about taxes. It isn't simply about health care. It isn't simply about whether Republicans or Democrats win the next election. There are political movements in this country openly questioning whether the constitutional system itself should continue to exist in its present form. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a front row seat to many of the organizations participating in that broader movement. The Constitution protects your right to hate this country. It protects your right to demand socialism. It protects your right to advocate abolishing the Senate. It even protects your right to advocate replacing the Constitution through lawful political means. But it does not give you the right to terrorize your neighbors. It doesn't give you the right to attack police officers. It does not give you the right to burn buildings. It does not give you the right to threaten political opponents. And it does not give you the right to use violence to impose your ideology on everyone else. That's not protest. That's not free speech. That's coercion through violence. And regardless of whether that violence comes from the radical left, the radical right, or anywhere else, a constitutional republic has both the authority and the responsibility to defend its citizens against it. The radicals have spent years telling us exactly what they believe. Now they're increasingly telling us exactly what they want to build in place of the system we have. Maybe it's time America started listening. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person we built this channel for. Left Coast News exists to cut through the noise and bring you straightforward analysis of the stories shaping Washington, the Pacific Northwest, and beyond. If you found this video valuable, please subscribe and follow us wherever you get your content, including YouTube, Rumble, Brighteon, BitChute, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, X, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. If you'd like to help support independent journalism, you can also join us on Patreon. Patreon is free for now. You'll find the link in the description below. And if you think this story matters, share it with your friends and family. That's one of the biggest ways you can help this channel grow. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Do you agree with this analysis, or do you see it differently? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching Left Coast News.